Thank you all so very much this afternoon. So we're just going to get started here. It's really interesting. Topic of this panel is America racist? And what I want to do before we get into this, because I know everybody's going to have thoughts and feelings about this, I'm going to ask every single member of our panel, first off, to define what's racism. Because one of the problems that we always have when people say, that's racist, this racist, the gift that's racist, is if everybody's kind of operating under a different definition, right? If everybody has a different definition of love, if everybody has a different definition of smart, if everybody has a different definition of what's funny, right, then none of us can ever agree that John Kerry's terrible, right? So, we need to have a universal definition of what is racism. So, starting with Elie, what's racist?
Yeah, so I have a very expansive definition of racism.
Okay.
It's pretty much anytime you think you know something about somebody based only on your perception of their race. Like anytime you want to make a judgment about the intellectual or moral skills of a person based on the amount of melanin in their skin and how you, again, perceive their race, which might not be accurate at all, like that is racist. So I lump, when I use the word racist, I lump in what other people use words for like prejudice or implicit bias or whatever. I just call all that racist because I'm a writer and being careful with words is important.
I think of it like the equation, the simple prejudice plus power.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's instructive to actually focus on outcomes when we're talking about racism. So I'm sure Tim Wise is going to give probably the smartest definition because that is your life's work. But I think, in my role as an analyst, I think in this moment it's important to think of it as outcomes, and we're focused on outcomes and the disparate outcomes depending upon who people are, right? You can't actually have the same quality of education because of your race. That would be an example of outcomes that are the result of racism. So that's how I see it, and I think it's helpful to put it in those frames in this moment.
Elwood, what's racist?
My definition of racist would be attitude, perception, plus power. I think that's how I would see racism. That's how I would define it.
Okay.
So now that Zerlina has said I'm going to have the most intelligent definition.
I'm actually pulling out a pad to take
I've
notes.
heard you do it.
So
I've heard you do it. So
the burden is incredibly high, so this shit could be really bad. I don't know. So I'm just going to say I'm going to make it not intellectual, but very grammatical. When I hear a word that ends with ISM, I know what it is. Because you think of other isms, capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism, authoritarianism. What are they? They are ideologies, but they're also systems, right? At the ideological level, we understand that racism is, generally the idea that certain people are better or lesser than on the basis of this thing called race. That's the interpersonal level that we sort of know, right? At the systemic level, which is where we get hung up and where so many people deny there even is such a thing, I would say that racism as a system is a structure in which there are policies, practices, and procedures which have the effect, again, going back to outcomes, whether or not intentional, of perpetuating, creating, or maintaining inequality between people on the basis of quote-unquote race or color, which is why you can have racism at a structural level that may or may not involve that attitude of superiority. It might, but it might not. It may just have the effect of perpetuating otherwise unnatural inequalities. So, there you have it.
Do you all take notes on that? There's a quiz.
That's why I didn't even try.
There's a quiz. There's two faculty up here, so there's a quiz. Okay, now, I know this may seem simple and pedantic, but it was important. I wanted to make sure that everybody here defined what is racist and what is racist first, because I have a second definition I'm going to hit them with that they weren't expecting. In your own words, and I know this seems like a junior high quiz, right? How do you define America? And I'm not being facetious when I say that, because when we say, is America racist, we don't all look at America as the same kind of place. So how would you sort of describe America? What is America to you?
I'm not trying to understand the question.
I mean, well, look, not like the sort of Donald Glover, this is America, but like, right. Do you see America as, is it the collection of people who live here? Is America the sort of structure of this government? What's America to you?
Yeah, so because of my legal training, I always go to the Constitution first, right?
Right.
I think of America as a system of democratic self-government as outlined in the Constitution that pushes us in one way or the other. It's a system of laws and structures and institutions that define what we are allowed to do. And so when I think of America, I probably think of like I probably think of it from a governmental and institutional level,
Okay.
way more than I think of it as like an interpersonal kind of thing. Because I don't, I'm from New York. I don't live in America. I live in New York, right? Like, and that's a whole different like thing that I'm not trying. Like, I don't, I wasn't counting. I lived for 13 months and 9 days in Indiana. I mean, maybe 9 hours too, right? Yeah, that's a whole different place. I mean, that might as well be the moon compared to where I'm from. So I don't think of us as being in the same country that way. I think of us as operating under the same system of law.
Okay.
Yes, I think America is racist defined by the fact that it's an idea.
Okay.
And I think that that's what I think America is. So I don't look at it, based on what those people who wrote the Constitution defined it as, because I don't know that they knew what it was going to become. I think that they had an idea in their heads of a collection of different types of people that were governed by the rights enumerated in the Constitution, but that it's an evolving idea, which is why I don't think the Constitution is a document in its original form that we should be following. I feel like it is always evolving because people are always evolving, and so that's what I think America is. America is an idea that is always evolving into an ideal of equal rights for every single person who lives here.
Yes, I think America is racist based on its history. I think the perception of many of the founding fathers when they began to craft and develop the Constitution, I think there was a sustained racism in our nation, and I think it's been there from past to present. And I think I would basically say America is racist based on its past, present, and likely for the foreseeable future history.
Well, given how I defined racism a minute ago, if we think of America as a system of policies, practices, and procedures, right, then the answer to this question is incredibly easy, because historically and contemporaneously, it would be that. If we think of it as an idea/ideal, though, it's very interesting. James Baldwin always talked about whether or not, and asked the question whether or not we were going to achieve our country, right? That was the phraseology that Baldwin used.
Yes.
What he obviously had in mind was a recognition that America, as existing at the time, was clearly racist, but that we had the potential to achieve our country as an ideal, which we had not done yet. So in that sense, in that sort of Baldwin-esque sense, right, America as an ideal is this constantly evolving thing that is not inherently or intrinsically racist.
Right.
It's a question of how we live that idea. But at the structural systemic level, it is indisputable that for at least the first couple hundred years of going back to the colonial period, several hundred years, this was a racist culture in society. The question is whether it still is, and that's what we'll be discussing. I think you probably know what my answer is, and most of us have. But
So what we've heard here, okay, is America the idea, America the policy, America the place, America where we all pay taxes, most of you, I assume. And when I think of sort of my definition of America, I tend to think of it very much culturally, which is sort of a combination of all these ideas, right? I think of the song from Team America World Police. America is all of the stuff that we do and that we think and that we associate and the constraints on it. And there's an element to that song, right, where they're thinking about, America, it's hot dogs, blah, blah, slavery, right? They have that line where they say slavery and they kind of, and then they keep going for the rest of the song and mention Playboy magazines and things like that. So what I'd like to ask the panel now is, we've defined racism, we've defined America. How has American racism manifested itself right here, right now? What are the things that we can point to right here and right now, 2019, here in Nashville, that say, oh, America is still racist? Because as Zerlina mentioned before, people need to understand outcomes. If you say America is a racist country, most people will say, if they don't already agree with you, they'll say, well, prove it. How? How is it racist today? We'll start with Tim at the end.
Well, first, let's say, I'm not sure the burden of proof is on us. And let me explain why I say that. If you have a country that was founded in white supremacy, and inarguably was a place where white supremacy was institutionalized, at least until the Civil Rights Movement, even if we want to say that's when it ended, which to me seems preposterous, but if we want to say that, then to say that I have to prove to you that a thing that was always a thing is still a thing, is like saying, Tim, prove to me inertia is still a thing. Well, inertia is a thing, not just when I roll a ball down a hill, but when I live in a society that was founded in a particular way. So I don't think the burden's on me. I think the burden is on white folks who deny it, and some people of color too, but disproportionately white folks, because keep in mind, these are the same people who denied it in 1962 and 3, when the Gallup organization asked white America, do you think black folks are treated equally? Now, if you say yes to that question now, we would all recognize you as historically illiterate and delusional, but 75% of white people then said yes, said that everything was fine. So I don't generally trust my people's perception on this. Secondly, what demonstrates that we are still that place is I can look at the data on wealth disparity, which did not come about in a free market, did not come about in some neutral universe where everybody had equal opportunity to accumulate. And the data says what? The typical white family has 15 times the net worth of the typical black family, 11 times that of the typical Latinx family. White households headed by high school dropouts now, hear me, high school dropouts, 1/3 more wealth than black households headed by college graduates. Either that is the result of the system of inequality that we still live with, or there is something inherently wrong with black people, which is an inherently racist argument based on every definition we gave. So it seems to me the answer to it, just on that one level, is obvious, but I think the burden of proof to prove that what was true is no longer true is on those who deny the truth to prove. It's not on us to demonstrate that water is wet. Right?
So hopping from that, I want to go to Elwood on this. So what Tim has just laid out is like, look, this is racist. It's been racist for a long time, but you have people who will still deny that. Okay, you have black people who will deny it. You will have white people who will deny it. You have, I mean, there was just another thing, I think it was the New York Times this week, where 60-something% of white America is like, racism is a problem, reverse racism is worse. From your perception, how has or why has this perception amongst large numbers of white Americans and certain number of black Americans and brown people that America isn't racist? Why do you think people are still holding on to that in the face of insurmountable evidence and outcomes that would lead them to come to a different conclusion? Why do you think people still hold on to it?
Well, first of all, let's get one thing straight. There is no such thing as reverse racism. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Or or reverse discrimination. Either you've been the victim of racism or discrimination, or you have not. Okay. So that being said, I think a number of reasons are there. One, I would say, is primarily the history. It's the history. America has a very ugly history when it comes to issues of race, particularly black-white relations. And there is a denial there. I think a lot of people want to think things have progressed tremendously. Now, even most of us who really look at things really, from a realistic perspective, nobody would deny that things haven't improved in America. Okay, we know that. But yes, there is still a substantial amount of racism in our nation. And I think for many whites, they just don't want to deal with that perception. Older whites are in a different world. There's a certain denial there. Younger whites are under the impression, well, we have the biggest stars in the world. We have movie stars. We have, people see Denzel Washington. They see, Michael Jackson, when he was popular, when he was alive. We have this, we have, Beyonce, and therefore, look who's in television. Look who's really, popular. Therefore, in their perception, everything is equal. And therefore, there is no significant racial problems at all. And if it is, their perception is probably maybe some quote-unquote backwoods individuals who are maybe, who are the real problem, but 95% of America is not. For people of color who are in denial about racism and say it's better, I think it's a form of Stockholm syndrome. And I think that they themselves are wanting to believe things are actually better than they were because they've been told by their parents or they've been told by media images and people around them. And everything in their environmental factors tell them that things are better when reality is it does not. You remember the situation that it was the University of Chicago professors, economics professors, who put out resumes, I think this was about 10 years ago, when they had the black names and white names, and they gave resumes where they were pretty much identical in stature. And in some cases, in the white resumes, they would have misspellings and grammatical errors and everything else. The white persons with names like Bianca or Weston or Chadwick still got calls, whereas people with names like Ebony, Jamal, or what they perceived to be more black-sounding names did not. So we see right there, racism is very, very prominent in our criminal justice system. It's prominent in economics, in our hiring practices, in our residential, and in pretty much every aspect of life. And I don't think we can deny that fact. And anybody who is in denial about it is in some deep denial, and to quote Tim, is somewhat delusional.
So one thing I want to add to that was really interesting. I did a study, I wrote this in the Source magazine years ago, about the history of naming. So in the United States, amongst boys and girls, the top black names and top white names for boys and girls were pretty similar until like the late 1960s, right? Top 5 white girls' names might have been like Mary and Susan and you know, whatever it is. And there was a tremendous amount of overlap. Huh?
Becky.
Becky, yeah, exactly. There's tons of black Beckys out there. And it didn't start changing until the early 70s, right? The early 70s is when you started seeing the Keishas, and actually the story kind of talked about the name Lisa, why you saw like a lot of the black girls in like 80 sitcoms were named Lisa. That was like considered a rare and dynamic thing at that particular point. But the point is that even with something as simple as naming, even when names were similar, black folk were still being pushed out of jobs, still not being given opportunities one way or another. So I want to jump to that with Zerlina. It's one thing to say, okay, America's racist, and this is what racism is, but I think the other thing people miss is that racism doesn't always manifest itself the same way. So how does racism play out differently, even amongst black people in what is an overall racist country?
Well, I mean, within the black community, I think it's more of a colorism issue, right? So if you're lighter skinned, you may have internalized messaging that is better, or if your hair, your curl texture is looser, then that is, quote, better or good. And so we just associate positive terms with things that are closer to whiteness,
right?
Essentially, even within the black community. But I've been thinking a lot as I've been listening to the other answers to your other question. The best example for me as to why right now, as to why you can look and see 2 different acts of criminality, and then there be 2 different outcomes. Donald Trump is on television every day committing crimes from the White House lawn.
Yeah.
And he is caging brown children on the border,
yeah,
who are seeking asylum. So for me, that's the reminder every day that America is a racist country and we treat people differently based upon who they are, a choice they did not make. You came out, you're here, you look how you look, and then the world around you treats you differently based on that. So I think for me, it's the different treatment when you have acts of criminality. I wanted to answer that question, I guess, is my point. I answered your new question, but I really wanted to answer that.
That's fine.
I'll answer a bit more of your old question. I think
nobody wants to answer the new question.
Yeah, apparently nobody wants to answer.
No, I'm saying I'll answer more of your new question. Your most recent question. Like, I think part of where you see kind of racial outcomes, even within the black community, also comes from the international aspect of it, where, you know, to white people, all us black people look the same to you. But within the black community, I mean, you've got black people from America, you've got black people from Jamaica, you've got black people from Africa, and like that there is a lot of racism amongst ourselves about that issue. And the reason why it happens is because, you know, my wife's from Zimbabwe, right? Like, when she watches BBC growing up, she gets beamed into her living room the same negative stereotypes about actual African Americans that white people get, right? When my family from Haiti thinks about what a black American is like, they think of them as a lazy, shiftless kind of person. And so when they come to America, they're like, I ain't like them people. I got 2 jobs. I'm willing to work. Like, they come with that same kind of immigrant, like, experience, which that immigrant drive and energy, which is great, but that also leads them to kind of crapping on black people who are already here because they've gotten the same media kind of training. And that is how I eventually get back to your old question, like, how is racism still kind of like a thing today? And so much of it is based on how we are perceived when we are just out in public, in part because of the media, what the media tells us we should be perceived. So, like, in the way that I always think about it this way is that, you know, when I walk past a cop, my entire kind of life issue is different than a white person, not because of my view of the cop, but because how the cop is going to view me, right? I could be any race under the goddamn sun, but if the cop sees me as black, then I have a problem, right? So one of my favorite little stories is that outside I smoke, which is bad, I know. Outside I'm smoking a cigarette, and this cop
You get a pass as long as Donald Trump is the president.
Yeah,
Thank you.
exactly.
Well, I quit, and I went out and
go.
bought my first pack of cigarettes in 2 years when they couldn't call Michigan. I was like, oh, shit. Anyway, so I need these.
There's a true story in the Washington Post. There is a story that Abby Phillips wrote at the time about Clinton staffers smoking, and I was one of them. She's talking about me.
Like, it was bad.
It comes back.
Anyway,
Yeah, it
so
comes back.
I'm outside smoking, and this cop is walking towards me, and I'm like, shit, what am I doing wrong? Am I allowed to be smoking here? Like, I'm having this whole, like, thing in my head. It was just a meter maid. She was just looking at, but like the level of stress and fear that I have, and so that's my final answer to your question. The way racism affects people is it takes up a space in my brain that could be used for like math, right? It could be used for whole other things. Maybe I could play an instrument. I don't fucking know, because I have to deal with, I have to have this whole part of my brain like taken up worrying about what white people are gonna do.
It's almost, it's almost like what Elie just said. It's almost like, I think Alvin Passan, who was, at the time was at Harvard, and he talked about it's like death by 1,000 cuts. And I think racism can manifest itself in so many ways. Like I said, it could be the perception that, students, maybe in academia, you hear students of color say a lot of times that professors are more likely to dismiss them, even at the graduate level, or more willing to work with white male students as opposed to students of color. Students will argue, or in the workplace, a conversation, as soon as you enter the room, it stops. Right. Those type of things. And those are kind of, it may not be it's subtle, but it's potentially lethal. And I think that's where you see over time that can certainly psychologically wear. And racism can be hazardous to your health. There's been studies that have come out and said, racism can be hazardous to your health, and many people, blacks, even professional blacks of all classes, tend to die earlier in life because a lot of it, they say, is due to race-related stress.
Well, and that actually reminds me of something Elie was talking about with regard to the immigrant experience. So what's fascinating, looking back at your original question about evidence of ongoing racism, when black migrants, those who were not African American born here, come to this country from the continent of Africa, from the Caribbean, their health outcomes, the first generation, are identical to white health outcomes in the United States, the immigrant generation. So in other words, they are actually having longer life expectancy, lower rates of low birth weight kids. Their health outcomes are pretty good. Their children's generation, literally one generation here, and all of a sudden their health outcomes have plummeted to the same level as African Americans. Now again, genetically there's no genetic or biological reason for that fall off. There's no cultural reason for that fall off. The only explanation that public health experts can find is that by the time that second generation has been experiencing American institutions of unequal treatment, they may come here talking bad about African Americans. Pretty soon they learn that there are some folks that don't see any difference at all, whether it's employers, whether it's cops, or whatever it is. And then the final point is just that other thing about the space that black folks have to take up in their brain to deal with racism. It's really important for the white people in this audience, because I'm the white person whisperer on the stage apparently. It's very important for those of us who are white to recognize that that's not just a black story, right, or a brown story. That by definition, it is also a white story about the shit that we don't think about every day, right? So we like to talk about racism as what happens to the people on the bottom of that system, which is part of it, but by definition, there is a flip side. And the fact that I don't have to sweat that, the fact that when I was 21 years old living in New Orleans and I'd locked myself out of my girlfriend's car and I'm trying to break in with a coat hanger, because for the young people that was the thing you used to do because there were knobs you had to pull up. I know that's like weird, but I'm breaking into the car. I hadn't shaved in like 4 days. I'm wearing a t-shirt and flip-flops and shorts. I'm breaking into a car. As far as this cop knows who comes up on the scene, I'm trying to steal a car. He stops, he gets out of his car, he says, "What's going on?" I said, "Oh, I locked myself out of my girlfriend's car. I'm trying to get in." He didn't ask for ID. He didn't ask for proof that this was my car. He actually looks at me and says, "You're doing that wrong." I'm like, "Doing what wrong?" He said, "Trying to break into a car wrong." I'm like, "Well, okay, you want to show me how?" He then tries. He couldn't do it either because apparently the automotive workmanship on the 1988 Toyota Tercel is just that freaking good. So he couldn't get in either. So he then looks at me frustrated and says, keeping in mind he has not asked me for any proof that I have the right to be in this car, he says, "We should just get a rock and throw it through the windshield." I said, "But my girlfriend will kill me." He's like, "Just tell her somebody broke in." I'm like, "Yeah, I will. You, a cop, you broke in." If anybody in this room thinks that a black person, including the black guy that I lived with at that time in that house, could have been breaking into a car outside of that house on a street in New Orleans or a street in Nashville or any street where you live and have that same outcome, you are not paying attention. And I don't mean to this panel, I mean to life in general. You were just not paying attention.
So I want to take a lot of these different things about how this country operates and take it to the sort of upcoming 2020 election. Or really, right now, we'll take a look at sort of the Democratic primary. America is racist. More black people perceive America as being racist than white people do. But any Democratic candidate who has any chance of defeating Donald Trump in 2020 has to speak to both of those audiences, right? They have to speak to black folk who are like, this whole thing is racist. They got to speak to white folk who are like, I don't really know if it's racist because I've got this black friend. So when you look at the candidates, who do you think is doing a good or a bad job of negotiating with having to campaign to black people and white people, knowing that sort of America is racist? And I'm going to give you guys sort of a quick example that you guys can also spend from, because I think they're all doing a fairly lousy job. I had a conversation with Mayor Pete a while back, and I asked him directly when he was talking about how asking about how you connect with black voters, and I asked him, and please forgive me, I'm going to use very, very candid language, but that was the language that I used when I spoke to him. And I said, can you remember the first time you heard someone say the word faggot? And he immediately could tell me. He was on the playground, blah, blah, telling me the whole story. And I said, now you grew up in Indiana. Can you tell me the first time you heard someone say nigger? No clue. No clue. And at one point he sort of stumbled and suggested, like, I don't know, it might have been a song. I'm like, dude, that's not the first time that you heard someone use that word, right?
Snoop did it to me.
Right, exactly. It's Dre's fault. So I say that because even well-meaning candidates often have, and I told them, I said, the fact that you don't know that is sort of exemplifying why many African American voters have doubts about you and lots of different kinds of candidates. So with that sort of as the catalyst, when you guys look at these people running, who do you think might get it in their head that America is racist and knows how to campaign that way to black and white voters?
I mean, I think Kamala Harris is doing a really good job of that. I think that she is doing so. If you're not up, the issue is code switching, right? Like lots of people talk about it. Books have been written about it. Like you have kind of one code that you have when you're talking to kind of a friendly audience or predominantly non-white audience. You kind of have a different code that you have when you're talking to predominantly white audience. Pretty much every black person in America can do it at some level. Like it's just part of like our upbringing and experience. And Kamala does code switching like super well. Like she gives all these little signs to the black community that she understands what's going on and that she's down with it and she's willing to fight with it, right? Like she went to an HBCU. She never lets you forget that she went to an HBCU, which serves as both saying like, I care about these issues, and by the way, Harvard grad guy, I'm blacker than you, right? Like just reminds you of that a little bit, right? She can stomp the yard, right? She knows how to step. That all comes out, like when you see her interact with children, it's in a very kind of like black mother way to interact with children. Yet, when she goes into prosecutor mode, it cons very, very well, I think, for a predominantly white audience who maybe is not up on some of these issues, but certainly understands the prosecutorial language in which she speaks. So I think she generally does a very good job. I think Cory Booker is the example of the guy that doesn't code switch very well. Like Cory Booker, and I say that with like love in my heart because like I have the same problem. like when Cory Booker code switches to black, you can hear the gears grinding, right? You can hear the like, I'm talking about Kool-Aid. Like just really has to like roll into it, and it takes them like a second, and people notice it, and it's like, oh, bro, you went to Stanford.
I mean, I'm surprised that you even consider that switching. I'm like, Cory Booker has a black. Like
I don't really
and I'm not saying that to be shady. I think he's just like
Cory's just Cory.
He is, and it's not. There is no.
It's authentically that corny.
Yeah,
just at all.
You said that. I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
Anyway, so I think Cory understands all of the issues correctly. I don't think he does a great job at communicating them. And since I'm generally on the let's be positive about Democrats today, that's all I'm going to say.
I'm going to be the negative one. I agree on Kamala. I also think Elizabeth Warren, especially recently, and I think that there are a lot of rollouts that are coming up very soon, where she's going to be speaking to racial justice and social justice issues more explicitly. So I'm looking forward to that because I think that any candidate that wants to win this nomination needs to center black people, black women, Latinas, in everything they're talking about. I mean, I don't understand why Biden and Amy Klobuchar and Mayor Pete, all three of them have something in common if you notice, have decided to run their campaigns only to try to get that Trump-Obama switch voter. That voter is not coming back.
Right.
If that voter is supporting Donald Trump post Charlottesville and go back to your country and lynching tweet and all of the nonsense we've been watching, they're not coming back. So I think that the 7% drop-off in black voters from 2012 to 16, that's where we need to be focusing. And so on the negative side of things, the people that are not doing it well, the white moderate candidates who can't figure out that, yes, the margins matter, right? The margins do matter, and you do need some of those voters back. But the base matters more, because if the base doesn't show up, the margins ain't gonna matter at all. So I just think that Biden and Amy Klobuchar and Mayor Pete, they've done this all at the debate. They do the thing where, well, Trump voters aren't racist, and they try to pat them on the head and be very gentle in not trying not to offend the white voter while they're offending black people.
Right.
So
Exactly.
I just think that don't say all Trump voters are not racist. Okay, well that wasn't really the point. The point is that they voted for a racist. They tolerated racism, and racism was not a deal breaker in casting that vote. And so that is a message to people of color in this country that racism is not that big of an issue for you. And again, going back to Tim's earlier point, that is the literal manifestation of white privilege. So Biden, Amy, Pete, do better.
Boom.
I would agree. Kamala Harris is doing a good job at it. Also, another candidate who is not getting a lot of traction, who I think, if you listen to the debates, is doing pretty well on addressing racial issues, is Julian Castro. I think he's talking about issues that really nobody else is really talking about as far as that affect the black community and communities of color.
He's the best on the police.
Yes,
He's the best.
law enforcement, yes, hands down. I think so. He's done a very, very good job on that issue as well. And I would also say, as far as as Zerlina said, yes, the people that people like Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, Joe Biden, and they're running as the centrist of the Democratic Party, but they're trying to go after a group of voters, like I said, who voted for Trump in 2016 and are largely voted for him based on racial appeals, coded racial appeals, and they are not coming back to the Democratic Party. The base of the Democratic Party, as I see it, has moved left. It's also gotten younger, it's gotten blacker, it's gotten browner, and I also think it's gotten gayer. So that being said, those are the people that the Democratic Party really need to pursue and focus their attention on. Otherwise, they're going to lose in 2020.
Can I just jump in off before I get to because you use that word and it's important. You use the word centrist and moderate. Like that's where the Amy's and the Pete's are running towards. And when they do that, when they run towards the center, it's like they have forgotten that there are black people in the center too, right? Like black people can be centrist too. We tend not to be centrist about whether or not the cops should kill us. Like we tend to have somewhat extreme views on police brutality. But on taxes, on healthcare, on all of the up and down the things, there are lots of black centrists. Go get them, go appeal to them, but you can't appeal to them by pretending they don't exist, and the only people who are working class in this country are white people. You're not gonna get them that way.
I would agree with all of that, and I'm just gonna add this. If you are a white candidate who has not cut your teeth in the racial justice movement, just be who you are and admit that as you try to do better, because the worst thing that can happen is for someone like Bernie Sanders, who did not cut his teeth on race justice, in spite of that thing in Chicago in 1964, whatever it was, 63, he is primarily a class-focused liberal or leftist, which is fine. Be that, do better, but you do better by listening to people of color. If you're Elizabeth Warren, if you're Pete, if you're Joe Biden, don't try to perform your wokeness for everyone by talking, if you're Joe Biden, about the black dude at the pool that you almost got in a knife fight with.
Corn pop,
Right? If you're Elizabeth Warren, don't do whatever here, I'm gonna drink a beer in my kitchen equivalent would be with a black person. Like, just show that you're willing to go to South Carolina, show that you're willing to go to Georgia, show that you're willing to go and sit with people of color and let them tell you what a racial justice agenda looks like, and then stand up and say, I'm somebody who's going to carry forward the agenda of the people who've been doing this every day when they weren't trying to get votes. That's how you do it. I think honestly the problem, and this is, I'm from Nashville, so I get real defensive about this and pissy about this, so just forgive me. But like, I honestly think that white Democrats or white liberals and progressives who are not from the South, right, actually start behind on this. Because if you're white from the South and you still ended up a progressive, I guarantee you it is through the lens of race that you came to that. You cannot grow up here and end up on the left and not have dealt with race. You can grow up in Portland, Oregon, or Portland, Maine, or Nebraska, and even though race is the background noise of all the shit that happens in your area too, you have the luxury of not knowing it. I do not. Right. I grew up here, I know full well white supremacy is everything. So if I still ended up a leftist, you know damn sure where I came for it, whereas you can be from anywhere else and not. And so I think if you've got white Democrats who are progressive but didn't grow up here, they need to navigate this territory very carefully. And that means listening to people of color, which is something that those of us who grew up here knew we had to do from the beginning, right? Because we were immersed in a different kind of world.
And I want to add to this, it's interesting. So not only is everybody on the panel right, but one of the things, I'm the politics editor at theroot.com, we do this thing every week, we've been doing it, we call the Presidential Black Power Rankings, right? So we do these power rankings and we take a look every single week at how the candidates are doing, the Democratic candidates are doing, in addressing the issues that sort of matter to black people and black voters. And one of the things that we recognize, which everybody here sort of touches upon, is that a lot of candidates know how to campaign to black people on a day, on a weekend, at a cookout, but they don't know how to campaign to black people for 52 weeks out of the year. And in a country where black people generally think that the United States is racist, and that our needs and concerns are ignored, a candidate who doesn't know how to address those things on a weekly basis, which is what we sort of pay attention to, is a candidate who's going to lose. And I'll use a quick example of this when you talk about the lenses that these folks come from. We have joked about it sort of in the rankings this week, but watching Elizabeth Warren go into this barbershop. Now, she needed a Sherpa, right? And I think Elizabeth Warren is a wonderfully sincere woman, but she looked like she had never stepped into a black barbershop in her entire life. And I'm like, you're a Massachusetts senator, there's barbershops in Boston, come on, this place is in Dorchester. She seemed completely confused, right? Joe Biden, and this is sort of the intricacies of racism, Joe Biden in charge of the crime bill, Joe Biden who makes up the funny story about corn pop, Joe Biden who still refuses to apologize for the crime bill, he's very comfortable in a black barbershop. So even comfort among black people doesn't mean that you're an anti-racism advocate, it just might mean that you watch the same sports or enjoy the same movies. And I think that's something that a lot of these candidates confuse. Comfort doesn't mean policy, right? Comfort doesn't mean that you're going to engage in radical change in the same way that having the majority of the black voter support doesn't mean that you're necessarily the best candidate for them. With that in mind, so I also want to make sure we go to this. I don't like talking about him too much, but we have to talk about President Trump. Because if we're talking about whether or not America's racist, we got to talk about the guy who's actually running the country right now. And I think there are so many different ways that people sort of emotionally and viscerally respond to him being in office. But I think it's important to talk about how Donald Trump, not just rhetorically, but is actually making America more racist. And there are levels at which he's making this country more racist that we will be dealing with long after he's gone. Him and Jared and the rest of his family, who I promise you will run. So, feel free to volunteer. Each one of you just jump up. How do you see Donald Trump as making America more racist than it was before he stepped in office?
It's the license that he's given to the racists, I think, is the obvious and most problematic thing, right? Like, there was a time in this country where people were embarrassed to be racist. They would do it, but they'd be I really need that job, so I'm just gonna be a little bit racist right now, just to get the job, and then we're all cool, right? But now it's just he's given them license, he's given them emboldenedness, he's given them voice, and that has effects in so many ways. My kids go to a ritzy private school, and it's my wife's fault. I'm lying. And the kinds of things that at this very elite liberal private school, the kinds of things that people feel emboldened to be able to say to me now versus what they would have felt like they could have said to me 5 years ago just floors me sometimes. Just that, people who think they're not racist or whatever, but Trump has set the bar so here. Now we've got parents being like, well, do you really think it's appropriate for you to make my son feel bad for being white. I'm like, what the hell? What the hell are you talking about? First of all, I'm not making your son feel bad for being white. Second of all, he should feel bad for being white, but that's something that he's gonna learn when he's a teenager. Like what, and three, man, this is a Wendy's. Like what the, like we you know, we're at the Chuck E. Cheese and you're like putting this on the table right now. Like what the hell is wrong with you, right? And that's the kind of thing, and again, it doesn't seem like it's for a lot of people, they don't make a direct line from Trump to that. I make a direct line from the president being such a big boiling ball of hate and derision and disgustingness that what trickles down is that your own hangups, your own issues, your own racist kink feels so much more acceptable that you can just like lay it out all in the street, whereas before you'd at least be embarrassed by yourself.
I want to add something before we go to Zerlina. And this is seen on so many different levels. It happened under Bill Clinton. There were sociologists who studied how certain sexual mores and experimentation with kids after the Starr Report started to change. There are things that happened under Barack Obama. I had a student who, right after Trump got elected, he used to teach, he used to coach like a junior high soccer team. And one kid used to attack other kids on the team and say, "I'm gonna grab you in the pussy." Now, as bad as that was, when he told the aggressive student's parents what he was doing, they laughed and said, "What's the big deal?" And that completely trickles down from the President of the United States. So, we see these things not just in our interpersonal interactions, but also sort of policy ways as well.
Yeah, so this reminded me of a time in the campaign. It was towards the end, and it was after Steve Bannon joined. So there was a lot of conversation on the campaign about how to talk about, the hiring of a white nationalist to be the campaign manager. Imagine what that meeting is,
right.
That brainstorm. And so I remember feeling frustrated that I felt like even the white colleagues that I was with didn't really understand. Like they knew it was bad, but they didn't feel like it was an emergency. Like set your hair on fire. This is white nationalism. This is Nazis. And so we had a meeting. Like I remember us having our own meeting, a meeting before the meeting of just the people of color in the comm staff. And we sat in that meeting and we were like, how do we go in there and convince these white people that this is a real problem that we need to deal with right now? Like, this is a bigger problem than, he said that offensive thing over there. We walked out of that meeting basically with the argument that Donald Trump has normalized racism again to the point where it is socially acceptable to be that openly in public and put people of color's lives in danger. So for us, it was an existential threat, and it was a very visceral fear that we had that Donald Trump being elected would put people of color's lives in danger. Now, that is exactly the reality we are living in currently, and so I feel like we were prescient, but not overly so. It doesn't take a genius to be a person of color and see what's right in front of your face. But, sort of the phrasing that we came up with at the time, and I think if you go back, Hillary started to say this more, Donald Trump is normalizing racism and bigotry. He's normalizing this kind of overt behavior in public and making it okay for people to be openly racist again. And I just think that in this moment, I just go back to, it's not about like political correctness or, being fake woke. We were talking about that earlier. Just don't be an asshole. Just don't be an asshole. Honestly, I'm serious. Like, if people actually just followed that rule more, don't say something, that makes you an asshole towards another person. Don't say something about who they are, something they couldn't change. They came out who they are. So why would you just want to be a jerk? I don't get that. But I think that Donald Trump has done a lot to normalize racism and overt bigotry, while at the same time encouraging people to behave in this cruel and mean-spirited way every single day, and that's almost seen like it's a quote-unquote good quality. And that's the saddest part of this moment.
I want to add this real quick. We're going to get the last two, and then we're going to start opening up for you guys to ask questions. So if you have thoughts and questions, get ready to sort of like line up and go here. I want to add something to what Zerlina said before we go to Elwood, before we go to Tim. It's not just the language, but she made a really good point about action. I can tell you, and I'm not going to speak for anybody else up here, but I can tell you, because we've had these conversations, the level of actual danger that black people in the media experience now because of this president is the likes of which you've never seen before. The things that we have to be concerned about because even here at Politicon, I can tell you that we have concerns about our safety because of not just the president's anger and racist statements about black people, but when you add black people to the enemy of the state, which is journalism, your life's in danger. And we've seen reporters and journalists get attacked and assaulted. So again, that's an actual functional manifestation that this president's in office. I don't think George Bush liked the press either, right? But I don't think Lester Holt was worried about his safety. I don't think Don Lemon was worried about his safety when George Bush was in office. Elwood.
I would say that America has, as we said earlier, has had a foundation of racism, but I think America has periodical acts of overt racism. And I don't think this is the only time we've seen that overt racism. I think what we saw it during the Reagan years as well. And some of us who were teenagers at the time younger, I think there was a message during the Reagan years that it was okay to be overtly racist as well. And Ronald Reagan was not, it was probably more code words and subtle, maybe welfare queens and, big black bucks and, forced busing, it was more subtle. But I think there was still a fairly there was a very segregationist mindset and a very, very racist mood during the Reagan years as well. So I think that was a fact.
So I'd agree with all this, and I would say, look, the most basic level, this administration is predicated, even in its slogan, to giving the middle finger to people of color. And here's what I mean. You walk around the convention hall, you got folks wearing their MAGA gear. I know some of y'all do that shit just because it pisses off the libs and you want to own the libs, whatever. Buy your cheap ass Chinese made gear for the guy that says he's gonna make America great, whatever. Do your thing. But here's the problem. When you rock that gear, you at least need to acknowledge that even if you aren't doing it to be deliberately an asshole to people of color, what you are saying is your history, your story doesn't mean shit to me, because there is no way that someone even remotely literate could say that there was a time in this country that America was great for black and brown folks, or that it was great for LGBTQ folk, or that it was great for anyone that wasn't Christian, or that it was great for women as women. Look, women as women could not get loans in their own name until 1971 when the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed. So what you were saying is, make America white, whether you acknowledge it or not. The effect is to say, even if I don't hate you, I care so little about your story that I can just basically flip you off every single day. So it isn't a question of whether those boys from Covington, Kentucky were doing war whoops or not, or saying build the wall or not. They were wearing that hat in Chocolate City, and they were saying to the black people who mostly populate Washington, basically, fuck y'all. That's what they were saying. And if that's not white supremacy, I do not know what white supremacy is. So if you're gonna wear it, but own what it means by definition. That's the shit that I need people to do.
And I think that also goes back to a lot of times these controversies about the blackface incidents that have been happening at college campuses, or even Justin Trudeau, who just won re-election as Canada Prime Minister, wore a blackface, and he was supposed to have be a liberal progressive for Canada. And I think that's a message too that a lot of these young kids are saying. When people tell them this is offensive, whatever, they're basically saying screw you. They don't care. I mean, the fact that they're doing this over and over again as well. One thing I would also say too is that one of the advantages, this advantage in a negative way that Donald Trump has, that maybe previous other presidents did not have, is social media. And I think they're able to use racist things, able to use social media, and able to get their messages out there. I mean, he's a president that tweets on a daily basis and insult somebody, something or someone. So I think with social media, we're beginning to see a lot of these dynamics that were always there, but they're being much more open to the public, and public has much more of an insight on them because we live in an era where there's social media. But it's also been beneficial for progressives to use social media, but on the same token, it's also been very beneficial for racists to use social media, because both sides and both camps can use the internet to their own advantages.
I like to always point out, and this is just off of Tim's point, that one of the ways that this country is so racist is that I can't piss off white people with my clothes. I would want to. I obviously try, right? But this country is so racist that I can't even figure out what it would be, what I would have to look like, what I would have to wear to tell all the white people to go fuck themselves. I can't, that's not an option for me, right? And that's how racist this country is, right? So, it's the defense of my hair, really.
Now, what I want to add also, like I said, we have microphones here. There's probably other microphones you can grab. If you have a question, I will say this comes from my academic background, okay? I always say this. The most terrifying statement in all panels is, I have a question and a comment. Okay, so please, we will be here afterwards for you to chat. Please try to ask a distinct question. I will try and help you get to a distinct question, and then we'll have one or two people answer it, and then we'll try and get to as many people as possible. So yes, ma'am, say your name and what is your distinct question?
Sorry, I'm vertically challenged. My name's Donna. I have just a statement, not a question.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I teach high school English and social studies, but my classroom is inside juvenile hall. So I am confronted every day with the effects of systemic racism. My challenge is when I'm out of there and I'm talking to a white person, a white Protestant male, who is saying to me, I can't get a job in San Francisco because I'm straight, I'm white, and I'm Christian. And I think it was you, Elie, who I first heard say, when you're starting from a position of privilege, any relinquishment of that privilege feels like oppression. And how do I make that case? I understand it, but I'm having trouble making that case to people who don't want to hear it.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, well, first of all, yeah, it's, as we were saying, reverse racism doesn't exist. That feeling of loss is so strong in white people, and I kind of get it, right? If I used to be able to own people and women, and then I can't anymore, like, that would be like, man, I lost something, right? Like, equality feels like oppression if you are used to your privilege. So how do you make the case to them? I mean, first of all, if I knew I'd run for office, and I don't know, so let me just start there, right? I don't really know. What I try to do is to, and it's almost like something you would do with your kids, like, point out all the good things they have in their life. Right, like, you know, some of my white friends, when I have to fight about this, I'm always like, tell me your credit score. I promise you it's better than mine. Right? And it's not because I'm terrible, but it's not because my wife is bad with money. It's because of, like, you know, and then we can start getting into, like, the historical, you know, redlining some of the historical challenges that my parents faced, that their parents didn't face, you know, blah, blah, blah. But, like, the thread that I try to pull is to get that white privileged person to acknowledge even one thing that he or she is actually privileged about, and then kind of pull the thread from there.
Well, not to mention, it's just not true. Like, there are plenty of white, straight men. First of all, the tech bros in Silicon Valley, most of whom are straight white men, live in San Francisco because they're like the only people who can. Right. So I would ask that person, like, how do you know that? Have you gone there to try to find a job? Is it possible that you just didn't get the job because there was somebody else more qualified than you? That speaks to that mentality of entitlement. But all these places where white folks, they can't get a job, if that were true, white unemployment would be double black unemployment, and it's not. It's the other way around, even with a college degree. So I would ask that person, like, I understand your frustration, but can we actually look at what the evidence suggests as opposed to what you've heard on talk radio or somebody told you that just isn't true, right?
Okay, next question.
College-educated whites, we know, is a part of the electorate that's particularly loyal to Donald Trump. In 2020, if you're a Democrat running, do you reach out to this portion of the electorate? And if so, what do you say?
So I would actually answer that and say that's true, except I would extrapolate out non-college educated white women and make them a distinct group from non-college educated white men, because actually it's Donald Trump supporters among the men. What we saw in the 2018 midterms is basically a rush, a dash away from the Republican Party among non-college educated white women and also suburban women, which is why so many of those swing districts in the House went to Democrats in the midterm elections, and, you know, we netted 40 seats when nobody was predicting a number that high. So I do think that, yes, you reach out to that group, but I think that you probably have a better time reaching out to non-college educated white women and talking about policies that actually will work to make their lives better, like universal childcare and universal pre-K and equal pay, raising the minimum wage, right? So targeting that specific group with policies and speaking in terms that resonates with them. Like, this is how this policy that I'm proposing will help your life, you know, get better tomorrow, and in these specific ways. Though that's, I think, the best and most effective message. I think some of the candidates are doing a better job of that than others. But the non-college educated white men, like, I don't know if that's our problem, right? I think that that's a complicated and nuanced analysis in terms of why they are supporting Donald Trump, despite all of the reasons why they should not, including that his policies are actually hurting them, right? But I think that, you know, that's deeper than just coming up with a message that would resonate. So I think that you're more effective in targeting those non-college educated white women. I would break that group up into 2 sections, even though it's not binary, but that's a whole other conversation.